because what Bill C-11 does is it might amplify Canadian content at home, but that inherently means it's going to quiet that content abroad. And so we won't have Canadian artists being discovered outside of Canada.
Hey everyone, it's Franco Terrazzano with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, here with my friend and colleague who's holding down the fort in Ontario, Jay Goldberg. Jay, I want to talk about Bill C-11, all right? The online censorship bill. It looks like we might see a little rumble in the jungle between the House and the Senate over this bill, Bill C-11. Jay, why don't you break down where we are with this bill and what might be happening next?
Yeah, so funny enough, this is the government censorship bill. We are trying to stand against it, and we are. But the Senate and our key senators, it might be the last line of defense we have for free speech and free expression online in Canada. The Senate is standing up, and they are not taking what the House of Commons is trying to shove down their throat. They're not taking it. The Minister of Heritage, Pablo Rodriguez, he keeps talking about C-11. He says there's nothing to see here. All we want is to promote Canadian culture. This is going to be fantastic. But look, there's senators who are just not convinced. And let me give you three quick quotes from three senators who are in different Senate caucuses. They're not all conservatives. These are three different senators, two of them in independent caucuses. So Senator David Adam Richards, he's a prize-winning author. People all across the country know him for his books. And he said about C-11 that it's a horrid bill, and he doesn't want any hierarchical politico deciding what men and women should be able to write. Senator Pamela Wallin, she spent years in journalism. There's a bit of a scandal she had in the Senate, but a long, long time in journalism. And she is asking a very good rhetorical question, which is, should any government or organization in a democracy be given the authority to override my choices or the choices of users everywhere? And then you got to love Senator Leo Varadkar, who is saying, instead of consumers deciding what shows up in their feeds, it will be the government. We don't want bureaucrats and gatekeepers at the CRTC deciding what we watch, and they don't want to lose their grip on power. So we've got senators on all sides raising the alarm, and they're not taking this lying down.
Yeah, seems like some of these senators are really fired up. Love some of those quotes that you just rattled off. Okay, so you got to help us understand kind of a distinction here, right? What's the difference in what the Senate wants to see out of C-11 and what the House of Commons wants to see out of C-11? What's the difference?
Right. So C-11 does two very negative things, the version that came out of the House bill. So the first thing it does is it filters and influences what comes up on your streaming feeds. The second thing is it filters and influences what comes up on your social media. What the Senate has done is they took a lot more time to look at the bill. The bill was rammed through the House. But in the Senate, they realized that, at minimum, our user-generated content, the stuff we post or see on social media, that should not be filtered by the government. The CRTC shouldn't be able to, look at what influence what we're going to see on TikTok or influence what comes up on our Facebook. And so the Senate very wisely adopted an amendment to the bill that says we're not giving the CRTC and the government the power to filter what you see on social media or what you can say. So that's a huge amendment. Obviously, the bill is still not perfect. The Senate bill still allows them to filter what comes up on our streaming feeds. We don't want to see that, of course, but this is huge. The fact that the Senate is standing up and saying, we don't want Canadians to have their social media influenced and filtered by government bureaucrats sitting in Ottawa. So this is a big deal. We can also talk further. All of a sudden, very recently, we're seeing some rumbling out of Quebec. There's some unhappiness here at the 11th hour. So it's good to see the Senate standing up, and there could be other challenges to this bill too.
Okay, you said in Quebec. What's going on there with Quebec and their Premier, François Legault?
So Legault, he's very, very popular in Quebec. Every political party in the last election was trying to win his favor. The last federal election was trying to win his favor. He's got very high approval ratings. And he's very defensive over Quebec culture. And so he brought up a vote in the National Assembly in Quebec, which is the provincial legislature, And unanimously, they all voted to say they wanted changes to C11 so that Quebec could have more control over the content that Quebecers are seeing and not having bureaucrats in Ottawa make that decision. So, obviously they're still looking for government control on the Quebec side. Look, we don't want to see the government controlling streaming feeds or social media feeds, whether it's, provincial governments or federal governments. We don't want to see this. But the implication is that if the province of Quebec is demanding that they have control over what Quebecers see on social media and on streaming feeds, that means the bill has to be, basically ripped apart and started again. And so that could kill Bill C11 and force the government to try it once again. And remember, this is their second attempt to get this censorship through. They tried with C10. They didn't get it in before the last election. They're trying with C11. If they have to make this change for Premier Legault, they'll have to go another time. And hopefully, if we can kill C11, they'll just give up after this. We'll see, but this could be huge.
Well, it's good to hear another politician lend their voice to the opposition against the federal government's online censorship bill. But I do want to shift gears just ever so slightly here and talk about some of the major Canadians who are not politicians that are against Bill C11.
Yeah, so one of the big ones, Margaret Atwood, she had a very powerful quote on C11. I think a lot of people saw it online, were very influenced by it. It was shared a lot. Michael Geist highlighted it for me, Dr. Michael Geist, University of Ottawa. So here's a quote that Atwood said on Bill C11, and this is her quote. I'll quote it directly. All you have to do is read some biographies of writers writing in the Soviet Union and the degrees of censorship they had to go through, government bureaucrats. It is creeping totalitarianism if government is telling creators what to create, unquote. That is pretty profound coming from Margaret Atwood, who, is not always the government critic, someone who is celebrated on all sides, I think, of the House and the political spectrum for some of the work she's done. We have pop artist Tesher is an Indian Canadian out of Regina, who has said repeatedly his career never would have taken off if Bill C11 was in place, because what Bill C11 does is it might amplify Canadian content at home, but that inherently means it's going to quiet that content abroad. And so we won't have Canadian artists being discovered outside of Canada in the way that we have had up to this point, if C11 is law. And so by implication, that actually means people like Justin Bieber, people like Drake, they haven't directly spoken out against Bill C11 themselves, but they're in the same boat as Tesher. They may not have been discovered if C11 was on the books. And I'll leave you with one last quote from comedian Darcy Michael. He came out and said, look, I'm Canadian, so I'm Canadian content. And he's dead on. We don't need overpaid bureaucrats in Ottawa in fancy suits running up and down the halls, making hundreds of thousands of dollars to decide what is Canadian and what we should watch and what we should see. We know, the creators know, and we don't need Ottawa getting in the way and telling us that.
Sure don't. So, Jay, you said there's going to be a little bit of a showdown between our House of Commons members of Parliament and the senators. But, specifically, what can we expect next? What are the next steps? What's happening?
So it looks like in early March, this could come to a vote. Now, I'll say the Legault news has broken in the last few days, maybe week. And so it could be that the government's, figuring out exactly how they want to go forward. But as it was a few days ago, the plan was early March. It's going to be brought to the House of Commons. But look, the House of Commons is going to have to decide. The way it works is both chambers, the House and the Senate, have to pass the same version of the bill. The Senate passed the version of the bill with the amendment that takes out user-generated content. So either the House can accept the amendment and vote to accept it, and then, you get Bill C11, but without the regulation of social media, or the House can demand that the Senate just accept what the House wants, allow for the regulation of social media. But again, the Senate doesn't necessarily have to say yes to that. So we could be in for an unprecedented situation. But we've been putting pressure on Government House Leader Mark Holland. We've been demanding, and we're encouraging our supporters to demand, that he ensure that if they're putting that vote to the floor in the House of Commons, that they accept the Senate amendment, because we cannot see a situation, nor should we, where we have our social media, what we see, what we can, what we view, how we interact with other people. That should not be influenced or filtered by the government. So I would encourage anyone, contact Mark Holland. He's the guy who's going to decide whether or not the amendment goes into the House of Commons version of the bill. So anyone listening, email Mark Holland. We can put his email in the show notes. He's got to know that at minimum, we want to see social media out of this bill.
Well, Jay, thanks so much for holding these politicians accountable and keeping their feet to the fire. And folks, it's coming down to the wire. If you haven't taken action yet, now is the time. Yesterday was the time, but today is as good as ever. So here's a few things that you can do. As Jay mentioned, fire off an email to Mark Holland. He is the Liberal member of Parliament, also the leader of the House of the government in the House of Commons. Call your member of Parliament. That's another thing that you can do. Give them a call, send them an email, tell them to speak out against this online censorship. And of course, head over to taxpayer.com, sign the petition, and share it with your friends and family so more Canadians can get in on this fight and protect freedom of expression.